This lecture is about the first of two texts that we're reading in this class, written by a woman named Hannah Arendt. And this one is taken from this book on revolution, which she wrote in 1956 in response, or beginning in 1956, in response to the Hungarian uprising against Soviet rule, which she found very uplifting. So I'll follow the typical pattern here. Let me tell you a little bit about Hannah Arendt herself. She was a political philosopher. She was originally German Jewish, and therefore was forced out of Germany in the early 1930s, at which point she came to the United States. She was affiliated with a group of thinkers who will probably have cause to refer to during this class. Often I do. The group is sometimes referred to as, their products are referred to as critical theory, and the group is often referred to also as the Frankfurt School, Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, I think it was initially called. This is a school which aimed to combine the thought of philosophers and social scientists for the purpose of diagnosing, criticizing, and providing cognitive alternatives to the existing structures of power. Interestingly, a whole bunch of those people, so this includes people like Walter Benjamin earlier on, he dies during World War II, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer. The younger generation included Jürgen Habermas and Hannah Arendt. Wilhelm Reich was sort of in that mix. Herbert Marcuse, lots of different people, and a whole lot of them got pushed out of Frankfurt to the United States. And that school was, for a period, restationed at the New School for Social Research. So a whole lot of them moved from Germany to the United States. And although this may seem like a real upgrade, they were actually more struck by the similarities that they thought they saw between these new totalitarian forms of government, state communism, Soviet-style state communism, and of course fascism as it appeared in Germany and Italy. These thinkers were impressed by the similarities that they saw between how fascism operated on people and their psychologies, and how contemporary media-based capitalism does the same. They thought that the same sort of bureaucratized, systematized, individual subsuming systems were really growing all over the world, whether they were called communist or capitalist. They saw more similarity than they saw difference between the capitalist and the communist world, and between the free world and the fascist world. So Hannah Arendt, maybe a good way to introduce her, and of course I'm not telling you about everything, but we're going to read her later, so we'll have a chance to talk more. But I think a good way to think about this text, because it was written in the wake of the Hungarian Revolution, which was relatively short-lived and by long-term standards unsuccessful. Because of World War II, because of the rise of fascism, and at the same time the rise of Stalinist totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt was particularly concerned with this problem. And so, by the way, I would take this as kind of a key trait of an engaged and ethical intellectual, that she thought it necessary to think through the society in which she lived in order to make recommendations about what would be better. She thought it was totally important to be able to see the large-scale systems of power which surround us and which are sucking us up. And to begin with, she was quite pessimistic about how things stood in the world in, say, like 1948 or something like that, post-World War II. She wrote this famous book, I can show you this one, called The Origins of Totalitarianism, complete with, Nazi image on the front. And this one was written 1948. And in that book, she describes differences between tyranny, classic old school tyranny, where one arguably corrupt leader exploits the rest of the population and keeps them in check through force and threats of force, and then totalitarianism, which she thought operated ultimately through terror and fear. It operated by producing this kind of paralysis in the population, producing a radical sense of isolation in each individual within a population. So totalitarianism is, equal parts bureaucratization, the networking and the infiltration of everyday life and private life, equal parts that, and a kind of psychological dimension where it operates to render individuals incapable of action, even incapable of critical thought. This is the way things are. This is the way they have to be. I just got to keep my head down. I got to stay quiet because any of us could be next. That was sort of the spirit of totalitarianism. And in that book in 1948, she speaks as if this is a great likelihood for the entirety of the globe. This could well be where we are all going. And she offers very little in the way of political solution then in 1948. But if you read the second book, the one that we're reading today, I think she writes an introduction there where she explains how her thinking on the possibilities of people to change their circumstance was altered by historical events, by the uprising in Hungary in 1956. And this uprising took a form that she knew from her study of history. She knew had also emerged in the American Revolution, in the French Revolution, in the early Russian Revolution. She doesn't mention Spain. It also happens in Spain. Probably the reason is that I think so. In Spain in 1936, we have anarchist organization of good portions of society. I think the reason she doesn't spend any time with that is that she's interested in political decision making, and she wants radical equality and radical democracy on that front. However, I would still consider her to be a liberal political theorist as opposed to a revolutionary or radical theorist, because she stopped short of some of the more radical proposals. Specifically, she's not willing to make recommendations, and she's deeply skeptical about the likely consequences of instituting on a systemic scale social and especially economic equality. So she's concerned with political decision making. She doesn't want any kind of program that would seek to organize economic structure. In this respect, I simply think she stops short. She's too liberal. She's too allied with the dominant classes, although she doesn't recognize it. But that's my criticism. For our purposes, you just need to know that what she's really talking about is political decision making, and specifically democratic decision making. This is what happened. Radical grassroots democratic decision making. This is what happened in Hungary in 1956, in Spain 1936, in Russia 1917, 1918, especially Ukraine, in Paris 1871, in Paris 1848, in Paris 1830, and of course in Germany 1918, and then in France. This is the period that we're really dealing with in our course right now. In France, 1789 to 1792 or something like this, and in the United States, what was to become the United States, in the couple of years leading up to the Constitution, or the period of time leading up to the Constitution. So this is her basic deal. She thinks, another way you can think about it is that she's attempting to understand what we might call the spirit of revolt. Another way to put this, she's trying to understand what is revolutionary social political structure, as opposed to what are the structures that revolutions typically and historically put in place afterwards, which effectively end the revolution and constitute the emergence of a new structure of, for simplicity's sake, in the US and in France, a new system of representative democracy. So we have direct democracy over here and representative democracy over here. And the spirit of revolt is related to direct democracy. Now you should remember these terms, right? This is from Rousseau. And by the way, our whole class works like this. We're always going to be building upon the things that went before. So in Rousseau, remember Rousseau thought that real democracy did not admit of representation. The way that he puts it, the will cannot be represented. This meant that all legislation, on his understanding, had to be voted on by the population itself. A representative governmental system has us, the electorate, voting to choose representatives, but then from that point forward, the representatives are actually in power. They, and the way that Arendt would think about it, they alone are actually free in the full human sense, where they are engaged on the basis of their understanding in a community of discourse and rationality. They are involved in thinking through, discussing, making decisions about, or you could even back up, identifying issues, talking through the issues, attempting to influence one another with respect to the issues, bringing the issue to a vote, aiming towards action, voting, taking a decision, and then shifting into a mode of action. That's purely human activity as far as a whole lot of the people in our tradition are concerned. You use your rationality, you use your free will. These things which are supposedly essential to human character are brought into action and are called upon and developed in the course of life. This is human, a purely and strongly human process. And the problem that Arendt identifies between these two moments, the revolutionary moment and the moment where a new government is formed, is that in the revolutionary moment, which can last and has lasted years, democratic function and freedom, what she thinks, the practice of freedom, actually doing what you are as a free person, versus like some negative idea of freedom, which consists just in people leaving me alone. Real, full, positive freedom is had over here in this revolutionary moment, and the space of freedom exists. You know, it's in the street, it's in like a community center, it's in the United States, it's in town halls. And these are multiple locations, and they are distributed across a large territory, and members of the citizenry at particular places have a place to go where they take part in the making of decisions. Arendt thought that the failure of the United States Constitution to include a formal role for the town hall was a great failure. Now she does think, and I think she's kind of like out of touch in certain ways, she thinks that everything turns out all right in the U.S. because of the system of checks and balances built into the Constitution. I think she gets weirdly uncritical at those moments. Anyway, so let's back up a little bit. I think there are three things we can deal with here. One is a history, which I outlined in the last lecture, so I'll go over that only briefly, and I've already been indicating that. Secondly, there are considerations about varieties of freedom, and she thinks that in a revolutionary circumstance, a profound and deeper and stronger, and probably, though she doesn't use this language here, more truly human form of freedom manifests itself. So it's the urge of human beings towards freedom. It's the urge not just to be free from things, which is a negative definition of freedom. Freedom just means the cops are not showing up at my door right now. I'm talking about revolutionary stuff, but they're not here because I have freedom of expression, right? That's the absence of something. But freedom as a positive phenomenon is the engagement of my deepest human traits in social, rational, free decision, discussion, mutual information, and then finally determinations about movement towards action and final engagement and action. That's freedom in the more positive sense. So I'll go over that one more time. And then there's this distinction between the sorts of structures that are existing in truly revolutionary periods, and then in the moment when those revolutionary circumstances get replaced. The point of talking about all of this, which is to talk about the council system, which is to talk about direct democracy, which is to talk about the practice of freedom. From my perspective, the point of discussing all of this stuff really, and I think Arendt agrees with this, though she agrees only on the political level, not on the economic level. The point of discussing this stuff is to say, hey, isn't this revolutionary practice isn't this revolutionary structure superior to what comes afterwards? Isn't it more amenable to human power? Isn't it more truly and deeply liberating than the alleged freedoms which come underneath a constitution and which at best seem to be negative in character? I'm not taking part in decision making except about, which of these two assholes do I want to be president, which is really no decision at all, especially since I didn't choose, in this case, Clinton or Trump, for the ticket. Isn't it the case that the revolutionary moment, the revolutionary practice, is really what we ought to be shooting for? Doesn't it just seem better? Isn't the council system better than representative government, centralized government, top-down government? That is the reason to talk through this stuff. Okay, so to go back to the history stuff, if you check out the notes that I have posted on Hannah Arendt, you'll see a couple of timelines that I just found on the web somewhere. This one gives you a quick summary of the periods of the French Revolution. There's our guy Robespierre from last time. This is the period of the Terror here, over which Robespierre was one of the key authorities, and then he gets killed in the same way. And then if you look here, here's a longer term chronology. And the point of showing this is to say, okay, so this is the revolutionary period. Here's the National Assembly, National Convention. Here's where actual fighting and violence begins. Here's the period of the Reign of Terror by the Jacobins. Here's the rise of Napoleon. Here's the point by which Napoleon becomes emperor. Here's the period, well, really from back here, it's a period of Napoleonic Wars. France has been marshaled into an unprecedented war machine. No one has seen anything like this, at least in Europe. And it's achieved by making every able-bodied man a soldier. The centralization of the government that was necessary, the integration of the general populace and their organizability was achieved by the Jacobins. They centralized everything, and this is one of the problems with their rule. And then the dictator, Napoleon, exceptional dictator, exceptional military mind, exceptional political mind, by all accounts, hyper intelligent, hyper exceptional individual, nevertheless extremely problematic from the perspective of freedom, since he marshals the entirety of France's men, and then sends them off to attack all of Europe. And they topple aristocracies and monarchies all over Europe, extending into Russia. But eventually, Napoleon gets defeated. The last point of this timeline is just to realize, but the revolutionary sentiment, the tendency to revolt, the insistence of the poor that their interests be represented, and maybe this is their mistake. They're always thinking about representation instead of thinking about holding on to power. They revolt again in 1830 because what had happened was that Louis the 18th and Charles the 10th have been put back in as kings. The structure of their rule is no longer quite what we saw with Charles Dickens, because now the alliances of the kings are not fundamentally with aristocrats, although maybe we have a new variety of oligarch going on here, but rather they are making relationships with capitalists. It's the bourgeoisie. It's the large money holders, bankers, and big business owners who are in the background of the king. Nevertheless, they conspire together with the king to back off rights, back off access to food, back off access to schools, all this stuff that pisses off the poor. And they have another revolt in 1830, and they depose the king. But they let themselves be taken over by the same thing again. So Louis Philippe is put into charge. These are like populist candidates to begin with, right? They get themselves into a position of power by pretending at the beginning to be nothing but the friend of the poor. Go back to Rousseau, right? This is the discourse on inequality. The rich are always pretending that their interests are the same as the poor so that they can get the poor to accept them, and then once they do, they hyper-exploit the poor because that's all they can do in order to maintain and expand their wealth. That is the source of wealth. So the French fall for it again. And this dude, Louis Philippe, used to cruise around in civilian attire. He would walk around without security. He talked to the general people. But the moment that he gets into power, he starts, give it maybe a year, starts backing off freedom of the press, starts leaning on his police much more heavily to suppress protest and dissent. The same practice happens over and over. 1848, revolutions all across Europe. Nearly every European nation goes through revolutionary convulsions that could well have toppled those countries, especially Germany and France. So near total, revolutionary moment, near success for that revolution. And then even up here again, 1871, the French are involved in a war with the Germans, and they lose. The Franco-Prussian War, it's called. I was trying to remember. They lose, and the population of Paris takes over Paris for a long period of time. And in this period as well, in 1871, we have a revolutionary circumstance. Here's a more detailed timeline of the French Revolution, if you want to check that out. And then everything else that I'm going to say is on this sheet. We're comparing two things, two varieties of freedom, two varieties of social, economic, political structure. So let's get on to that. In all of these moments, in the American Revolution, in the French Revolution, in 1830, in 1848, in 1871, in 1917 in Russia, 1918 in Ukraine, 1918 in Germany, 1936 in Spain, 1956 in Hungary, a similar thing happens. And that is that the power, the centralized power of the state, which had been allied with, except in the case of Hungary, where we have a state socialist control coming from the Soviet Union. In the other instances, we have an alliance between the state apparatus, by which I mean the police, the military, the court system, the prison system, the legislative system, the executive system, the judicial system. All of these things, we have an alliance of that apparatus, a whole bunch of institutions that work together in order to bear upon and regulate the lives of people, and ultimately, in the last instance, to threaten the lives of people, which arguably is the basis of state sovereignty. In the last instance, what makes the state is that the state can kill you, and it can supposedly do so legitimately. In every one of these circumstances, in place of an alliance between the moneyed class or some other centralized privileged class, like say the Soviet Politburo, the alliance between mostly the moneyed class and the state apparatus, that system of top-down rule is pushed off. And it's pushed off in many cases by force of arms and by the taking over of streets and the establishing of barricades, the refusal to allow physical and economic activity to continue as usual, the refusal to allow troops and soldiers, the arms and the fingers of the state, access to the places where regular people live. This is one way in which the state is pushed back. But then something fills the void. And this is, again, what I would call a dual power situation. What is grown in each one of these circumstances, in the United States, the nascent United States, as it moves towards independence, there's a movement based on the town hall assemblies. So across the colonies, white settlers are gathering together in town halls in order to identify their issues, discuss what should be done about them, inform one another about information that is necessary for decision making, then to move towards formal voting so as to take a decision, and then to move into concerted and social group activity. That existed in the US. It existed in France in the 48 sections of the Paris Commune. It existed more broadly distributed across French territory. It existed in the popular societies. Every one of these entities took self-government upon itself. And this is the spirit of revolt, as far as Arendt is concerned. The spirit of revolt involves not just demanding that your freedoms in a negative sense be sustained, meaning that I don't want cops to show up to my door right now. I don't want this video document that I'm making for you to look at to be impounded and destroyed. I have the freedom to do this stuff, but that's negative freedom. Instead of relaxing on the basis of negative freedom, what happens in these periods of revolt is something much more robust. something much more human, something much more compelling, and potentially something much more effective in expressing the will of the people, identifying and expressing and following through the will of the population. And that is grassroots, locally based council democracy. In every one of these cases, that same thing happens. So we have this period, sometimes in Hungary, a few months, in Russia, maybe a few years before ultimately the Bolshevik power center infiltrated all of the different Soviets and centralized them, got rid of everybody who wanted to preserve the local autonomy of the Soviet and its capacity to make decisions, for example, about how it was going to do agriculture. This is a big dispute in the early Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks were super scientistic. They believed that agriculture in particular had to be carried out only by the most modern methods. So we need industrialized farming, we need monocropping, we need tractors, we need rectangular plots. And many of these things went opposite the practices that were already in place with this Russian peasantry. They liked to do split plots. They liked to polycrop. They worked according to, they used older machinery. Their practices, had they been left to their own devices, most likely they would have continued to practice agriculture in the way that they had before. The power elite in Moscow, however, the intellectuals who believed that they knew what was best for everybody else, insisted upon top-down regimentation. And this meant all kinds of things. So it meant taking people out of their huts and putting them in new dormitories, lifting up populations and putting them in new places. It's super harsh. And in the end, it's arguable that the system that had been in place before was actually agriculturally more productive than the one that was put in place afterwards, the industrialized system that was put into place afterwards. But what the regimented pattern that the Bolsheviks employed, and which is very similar to patterns that have been employed in the United States too. The Bolsheviks even employed a good number of members of the Tennessee Valley Authority, who set up a massive system of dams in the South. They employed those same people to come and organize land for them. So the way that the Western world and the communist world were unfolding historically was actually very similar. It was all top down. It was all monocrop. It was all industrial. It was all, chemicals and fertilizers. But the value that this system had was not ultimately in its agricultural productivity, although that's what we've always been told. It was actually in the regimentation of the people themselves. It made it possible for that center of power in Moscow to keep control over these Soviets, which were nominally self-governing, but which in practice were anything but. Anyway, so that's the shift, right? The shift is from decentralization to centralization. It's from direct local control of circumstances to indirect control of local circumstances by a distant center. So this is the difference in terms of political structure. Arendt just wants to focus on the decision-making processes. In one moment, in all of these periods, we have a robust, strong, active life of the locality where humans are gathering together and making decisions together. And on the basis of the multiple decisions of all these localities, power and decision-making percolate up through federal assemblies where ideally within this system, each one of these localities will send so-called representatives, which may seem to violate the principle I offered a bit ago, but it doesn't. They send representatives, which in this case are really representatives, or they're like delegates. All that these representatives can do in the council system is report on the decisions that have been made at the lowest level. They cannot make decisions themselves. They do not hold power. There are all kinds of checks put in place to make sure that the representatives do not become new tyrants, new rulers which would inhibit the capacity of people to engage in free political activity. For example, no one can have being a representative as a full-time job. Terms are super limited, 6 months or a year maybe. And this is super important. All representatives are subject to recall at any point. So the moment that somebody who is supposed to be delivering the message and bringing back information, that's the idea. They go to a federal assembly, they share the interests and the concerns of their constituency. So does everybody else. An image is gotten of the layout of all of these different interests. Some discussion takes place as to how these differences could be worked through, how compromise could happen, how rational discussion can happen at this broader geographical level. But decisions are not taken yet. Now all the information is taken back to the local councils, and they talk it through again, and they send their representatives to share their opinion again. So power is kept at the low level. Power is kept at the local level. And ideally, well, not ideally, in reality, in these revolutionary periods, there's massive participation by the populace because they have an interest in changing things in their environment for their betterment. And because at this point it really is the case that power really does exist here. This is quite different from people telling us, hey man, you got to get involved, you really got to go vote, you can't complain if you don't go vote. Well, maybe it's the case that our apathy is actually a form of wisdom, as I said in some previous lecture. Maybe we just recognize that we don't actually have the power, but we could. I mean, to me, this is the lesson of this revolutionary period, that people really can and do govern themselves, and they can live without a centralized structure. They can live without a state apparatus, but they have to be engaged. Okay, so last thing I'll say, and then I'll just move on to some questions. Let's distinguish clearly between what I would call two varieties of freedom that Arendt is talking about. Now, I've named these both already, but I want to go over them again just so that you can make sure to understand. In the revolutionary circumstance, under the influence of the so-called revolutionary spirit, there is one variety of freedom which Arendt will refer to as positive freedom. She also says there's a particular variety of happiness which holds sway during these revolutionary periods, and that is, she calls it public happiness. It's fulfilling to the individuals living in these energized periods just to take part in this decision making, just to take part in the gathering together of equals, to understand things, to share with one another, to mutually instruct one another, to mutually aid one another. This is public happiness, meaning happiness of humans as a group in the street taking over public space. And it's positive freedom, meaning that it is not freedom from something, but it is freedom to engage in and develop my most human capacities, specifically my ability to think, my ability to speak, my ability to reason, my ability to make choices. These are all things I have almost as an individual, although, well, I am talking to myself in this room, right? But my communication is not complete unless you show up. So freedom on this level is something that is intrinsic as a potentiality within all human beings, but which is realized only as a group in action. And maybe that's the most important thing here. This positive freedom has to do with action. You actually are doing things. You are doing government. You're doing self-government. And there exists a space for this action. In the nascent United States, it's the town hall. In Paris, it's the street. It's the neighborhood. They were literally just taking over some portion, some street within a neighborhood and having big neighborhood meetings at those places. So you have to construct that space of freedom. By the way, I think a whole lot of contemporary struggles have to do with the momentary liberation of certain spaces from being what now is called public, but that means like surveilled, state administered, a whole lot of rules. What Occupy was based on, and what the Occupy UC campaigns and stuff like that were based on, was the taking over of space in which to engage in radical direct democracy. So Occupy is totally related to this this history that we're looking at. Okay, so you have positive freedom. But then we can look at the shift from positive freedom to negative freedom, and the shift from the revolutionary spirit to something else, by thinking, as Arendt does, about the unfortunate goal that revolutionaries in the American and the French revolutions had. They were thinking, okay, so the system is all messed up. The tyrant is oppressing us. Now, this is abbreviation, especially in the American case, because really it's that a certain small set of merchants were incapable of making the full degree of profit that they wanted to make. Meanwhile, there were these sort of pressure situations going on between, say, the growing population of farmers in Pennsylvania who wanted to push west into Ohio, which was beautiful farm country, but were prohibited doing so by the British after the British victory in the French and Indian War. So there are all these different antagonisms and contradictions, etc. Anyway, this leads people to, move into a revolutionary phase. But then the idea that they had was that, okay, we're making a new government. This is the problem. And this is related to the model of revolution that we're going to talk about through the class, these two varieties of models for revolution. The Leninist one, which says the goal of revolution is to take state power, and the Zapatista one, which says, no, like our revolution is to construct autonomy for ourselves and our people, and we are not aiming at state power. Well, there's a variety of the state power model to be had in the American and the French Revolution. So, what Jefferson thought, and this is one of the people that Arendt talks about at length, is that the goal of revolution is to make a new constitution. And that means, and Jefferson, she says Jefferson alone sort of recognized this problem. It means that this full freedom, positive freedom, and public happiness, the full realization of direct democracy, was an experience that was to be had only by the founding generation. They engaged in this full, public, widespread, democratic movement only in order to arrive at a point where all that freedom would again be constrained within the halls of a small building with a small number of people within it. So she uses the term foundation. They aimed at foundation, meaning that they sought not to perpetuate the system of councils, the system of real democratic control, but rather to set up a formal and bureaucratic system where representatives of the people, who these upper class people thought would be much more manageable and who would be from their own class, these representatives are going to do decision making. So look what happened to the so-called space of freedom between the revolutionary period and the constitutional period, or the founded period. It shrinks. It shrinks radically. It almost blinks out of existence. Where you had a space of freedom on every street corner in 1791, 1792 maybe, where you have a space of freedom in every town hall in 1775, by, in the American case, 1790, in the French case, by 1797, earlier, 1794, in the course of the terror, the Jacobins are centralizing everything. They're taking over all of these communes or collectives or councils themselves. By this latter case, where is political decision making happening? Well, it's happening only in the parliament. It's happening only in this and in the executive branch. It's something that a very few prestigious, privileged, white men get to make decisions for everybody else. So the spirit of revolt gets lost. Now, Arendt does think, pragmatically, that The United States government, for example, she thinks is very interesting. She thinks the constitutional structure is very interesting and quite effective. But there's a lament here, fundamental lament, which is that freedom has been lost. And she does believe, along with philosophers like Rousseau, that freedom is central to us. So where we had positive freedom and public happiness, we now get negative freedom and private happiness. So what does this mean? This is important because I think when most of you, and I say this just because of experience teaching this class a number of times, when most of us think about freedom, we think about negative freedom. And we'll say things like, well, in this country, we're free to say what we want. That means I may speak without being interfered with. My freedom consists in the absence of something, the absence of being hindered. Or I am free to purchase whatever I want. Nobody stops me getting the kind of bread that I like. I am free to drive wherever I want all over the country, provided that I have the money to do so. And of course, this is not really true because I can't go on the military bases, right? And pretty soon it'll be hard even to get into the national parks. All of these models for freedom are negative models. And because students often start thinking this is the only variety of freedom, and it's not, they often arrive at the sort of self-defeated, potentially cynical position where they're like, but of course, it's impossible to have absolute freedom. We couldn't be allowed to do everything because then we would hurt one another. So, our freedom has to be limited. And everybody's like, well, pragmatically, we're resigned to that. What gets overlooked in that whole picture is the idea that freedom is not just the absence of people getting in your way. Freedom is actually a positive phenomenon which has to be practiced. It has to involve practice. The practice of getting together with other people, the practice of recognizing one another as centers of intellectual decision-making and willful choice. Therefore, the recognition of individuals as equals. And then the taking part in intellectual discussion. This is not just something that you're free to do in the negative sense. This is the exercise of your deepest human capacities, which are social. That's something that has to happen. You have to do it. It requires effort. It requires practice. You can get better at it or worse at it. If we think about freedom in this way, that it has a positive dimension as well as just being negative, then we're on a better course, I think. And then we can get much closer to the questions of self-government. Because without self-government, true self-government, on a local basis, according to Rousseau, probably according to Arendt, human nature is being travestied. It's being stomped on and broken into pieces. Similarly, and I think this is my last point, similarly, remember, in the revolutionary circumstance, revolutionary Paris, revolutionary New England, there was public happiness. Like, people understood that there was gratification in controlling the street, gratification in meeting together with their neighbors and their colleagues on an equal footing in order to make decisions. That was public happiness. But then what we get in the founded situation, the post-revolutionary situation, is private happiness. We get a recodification of like what human life is for. What is the best thing that we can achieve? I mean, pretty much everybody's agreed that what humans want is to be happy. And if you want the classic treatment of this, you go and you read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Aristotle's Politics. Everybody agrees, I think, almost by definition, that humans want to be happy, right? But notice that how we're understanding happiness is radically different in the revolutionary circumstance, where happiness consists in solidarity, community, mutual activity. In the case where we now live, we have a recodification of happiness. Now, happiness is private, and I have the right to hang out in my house and smoke dope and drink whiskey and watch porn, or watch Disney and drink chamomile tea, or read the gossip column and check my Instagram, and I have all these so-called freedoms in the privacy of my own home. So the space of, I think the tragedy here if you want to push it, the tragedy is that the space of freedom has shrunk. And the freedom that I get in my own home is only negative freedom. It's not positive freedom. It's not realizing my potentialities. It's not allowing me to direct things. It's not building solidarity with my neighbors so that as a block of individuals we become more stronger than we were as individuals. It's not this freedom. It's not this full positive freedom. It's a negative freedom, meaning that nobody is going to interfere with my porn viewing or whatever it is. And this space of freedom is sort of sadly individualized. It's broken down to the home unit. Like, okay, inside your apartment, you are free to watch whatever channel you want, provided you could afford your cable bill, your streaming service that month. And that's what we get as freedom. That's what we get as happiness. But on this fuller model, there can be no happiness in private. I'm a social creature. I need to realize my integration with other people in practice. Absent that, I have only the shade, the shadow of freedom. And this is what Arendt talks about as a sort of tragedy, that participants within revolutionary periods experience something much greater, much fuller, much more in line with human nature than all the other generations get to. That period of real freedom, of deciding, of being engaged in social action, using our intellect, and recognizing one another as equals. That experience was reserved only for the special revolutionary few who now we have to mythologize in the terms of, founding fathers, etc., as if they were capable of something different from us because they're humans of a different stature, which is bullshit, of course, and they're all real short. That ends up being something reserved for that special and privileged generation, and we get screwed. But then we end up repeating these empty, hollow phrases about how we are the freest country in the world, how we have all these freedoms. That's why those other people, the terrorists, hate us. I mean, this is all largely bullshit. Now, it may be the case that certain activities are allowed to happen without impedance, but that's no proof that you're fully free. And of course, at the same time, I think we're free to say whatever we want, sort of, although, did I mention, I know that the people who are publicizing the situation in Rojava, their internet accounts, their social media keep getting blocked because the U.S. has an agreement with Turkey, its NATO ally, not to allow the publicization and thus the potential generation of support for a movement which does not suit the Turkish government. So there actually are constraints. You just don't see them that much. But you could have like an absolutely libertarian situation, So now we're going to get to smoke pot legally, as if we weren't doing that already. Well, we were doing it illegally. We can travel. We can call whoever we want. We can email whoever we want and say whatever we want. But of course, those emails and those phone calls are actually being swept up and scanned. And if enough catchphrases show up, or if you end up in a social network diagrammed by intelligence algorithms showing a certain proximity to persons of alleged interest, then more of your shit is going to be monitored. The freedoms that we have are limited. But even if they were totally free, even if there were just a total absence of constraint, that wouldn't be good enough on Arendt's account. It wouldn't be good enough because how in that respect would we differ from, she would say things like, how would we differ from animals? We have to realize our actual human potential. And so what I would ask you to think about out of all this stuff, just to translate everything I just said into a few questions, isn't it the case that, let's go back to the beginning. Maybe these are like Rousseau questions. Do you agree that free will and rational thought, which involves discussion with other people, are intrinsic to human character? Do you think that's true? That like a distinctive thing about human beings, maybe the thing that most distinguishes them, is free will and rational decision making. And aren't these things, especially the latter, fundamentally social? Now, if so, isn't it the case that in these revolutionary circumstances, people experienced something which is really cool? Isn't it true that it seems like living through these periods would be really cool? Less secure, perhaps. more turbulent, more exciting, more gratifying, insofar as these situations realize an aspect of human nature which otherwise is completely suppressed. To put it even more simply, isn't it true that these people experience freedom in a much bigger, fuller, better sense than we do? And to flip that on its head, isn't the freedom to trade, businesses to do business deals as they like, and the freedom to consume, to buy what I want, provided that I have the money, which means freedom to be servile before that at work. Aren't these freedoms pale, shabby simulacra, fake representations of something that otherwise would be much cooler? And maybe lastly, isn't it the case that for humans fully to realize these potentialities of theirs and to achieve full public happiness, happiness as a group, happiness in the street where we live, better happiness, isn't it the case that in order for this to happen, we have to conquer spaces of freedom? There have to be places where we get together, we speak freely, and we move towards action and we take action. There's this do-it-yourself mentality, vibe that has to be in place, doesn't it, for us to fully realize ourselves? Don't we have to take spaces of freedom? Don't we have to make spaces of freedom? And perhaps, in the long view, maybe revolutionary work to reconstruct a system or to liberate it to some extent from state controls and the control by the rich, maybe that could consist, as in the Occupy experiment, maybe that could consist in taking, nurturing, developing spaces where people come together and make mutual decisions.